Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Biden versus Trump. The race to the White House may come down to the economic records of the two leading presidential candidates. So who's fared better? Argentina's president gets his landmark economic reforms approved by parliament. That's a big win for him. But what about Argentinians? Do they win too? And China's growing influence in Latin America is worrying the US. We'll look at the new Chinese megaport in Peru and its impact on the nation's economy. The first US presidential debate might be remembered for Joe Biden's faltering performance, but many on Wall Street give the president top marks on his handling of the economy. A high-tech boom is in full swing, and the stock market has never been higher. Many people on Main Street, though, are not convinced. They say they trust former President Donald Trump more, with the high cost of living a major concern. What American voters think on the issue could decide who wins the race to the White House. So, who's managed the world's largest economy better? We'll discuss that with our guest in a few minutes. But first, Alexandra Byers reports.
With less than 4 months until the U.S. presidential election, the number one priority for most voters is the economy.
It seems it's going in the wrong direction. We need help with inflation, with, every pretty much middle-class American needs some answers to what's going on and how we can change the direction of where we're going right now.
Overall economic growth has actually been better under Joe Biden than Donald Trump before him. And Biden's delivered the strongest job market in more than half a century. But inflation jumped to a 40-year high, sending consumer prices skyrocketing. That's affecting voters on a daily basis. And in poll after poll, Americans are saying they prefer Trump over Biden when it comes to the economy.
Inflation was very low under his administration. Groceries, gas, housing, everything was low when he was in office.
Both administrations were heavily affected by COVID-19. Trump took office in the middle of a well-established economic expansion that came to an abrupt halt when it hit a global pandemic. Biden had to deal with the aftermath. The candidates blame each other for America's economic woes.
We had the greatest economy ever in the history of the world. COVID came in and we did an unbelievable job, and by the time we ended, we gave him the greatest bounce back that anybody's ever had. And guess what? He blew it to shreds.
Biden is trying to counter any economic pessimism and says his administration's policies are the way forward.
We have dramatically reduced inflation from 9% down to close to 3%. We're in a situation where we're better situated than we were when we took office, where inflation was skyrocketing. And we have a plan to deal with it, whereas my opposition talks about two things. They just want to cut taxes for the wealthy and raise taxes on other people.
President Biden had no control over the pandemic-battered economy he inherited, with its massive stimulus packages and supply chain disruptions. But many voters continue to blame him for it, and consumer confidence could decide the outcome of the election. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Americans continue to have a negative view of the economy despite major indicators that it's actually doing pretty well. As you heard, unemployment is low, inflation is significantly down from 2022, wages are up, and the stock market is hitting new all-time highs. But voters' experience of the economy begins with their spending power, and under Biden, that's on track to be the worst of any post-World War II presidency. The economy took a hit during the pandemic, but prices didn't significantly rise until Biden's first year in office and have now increased more than 19%. At a similar point in Trump's presidency, prices had only risen around 5%. Voters are feeling it when they fill up their gas tanks, where the average price of a gallon of petrol rose to $3.76 by May this year. They're also feeling the pinch as they buy their groceries. A loaf of bread now costs nearly $2, and the price of a dozen eggs has jumped to just under $3. As for who's to blame, Well, most analysts point to pandemic relief programs under both presidents and supply chain issues when the global economy revved back into gear. Joining us now from London is Greg Swenson, who's a founding partner at merchant bank Brigg Macadam. Good to have you with us, as always, Greg. For a supposedly unpopular president, Wall Street sure seems to like President Biden. Why the disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street?
Adrian, great question. I think if you look at Biden's economy, it's similar to the Obama years, where Wall Street loves it. If you have zero interest rates like we did during the Obama years, and still relatively low interest rates now from a historical perspective, and then you have hostility to the supply side, which creates jobs, and it also creates services and goods to supply the economy and keep prices down. So it's really apples and oranges. The Wall Street loves it because there's asset inflation, but yet Main Street is suffering. And as you pointed out, with 5% total inflation under Trump and 19% under Biden, that's really the biggest moving indicator for the economy for most Americans.
But inflation is coming down. Is there enough time between now and the election in November to people to feel that little bit richer and come to the conclusion that, yeah, okay, Biden's doing all right?
Well, I think the key word you used was little bit. Yeah. I mean, I think, wages are going up and inflation is coming down. You've actually seen a few months of real wage growth in the economy. But Biden set a record 24 straight months of negative real wage growth in his first 3 years. So that's a really tough hurdle to overcome when, as you said in the intro, prices are still high. They're, 20% higher for food, and you've got 25% higher for petrol prices. So this is a really difficult challenge for an incumbent president sitting on, on that kind of inflation and that kind of deterioration in real wages.
And thanks to what the Biden administration has done, and indeed, I suppose, the Trump administration before Biden came in, inflation is now beginning to come down. If Trump wins, he'll be able to claim success on the back of the Biden administration's work, won't he?
Well, I don't know if the work has been successful. I mean, inflation naturally comes down, especially with the Fed hiking interest rates as much as they have. So that's just natural. But Biden's still very hostile to the supply side. And I think a lot of people overlook that. Many economists overlook that. It's not just the demand and reducing the stimulus, which obviously the stimulus at the beginning of Biden's administration and also Trump's stimulus during the COVID pandemic, that is what caused the demand side, but it's hostility to the supply side, especially the energy sector. You saw gas prices or petrol prices going up immediately when Biden won the election, because I think the electorate knew, the markets knew that he would be very hostile to the oil and gas sector, which he was and continues to be. So, the kind of policies on the supply side are making the reduction in inflation difficult. It's still sticky. It's still in mid threes, and that's way over the target of 2% from the Fed.
The big question has to be: would a second Trump administration handle the economy any better than the current Biden administration?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, it's completely different. You've got a president in Trump that liberated the supply side by reducing regulations, and Biden's regulatory burden is significantly higher than even Obama's. And so that's really hurting the economy. The compliance costs average $13,000 per employee in the US. So Trump will go back to his deregulation policies from his first administration. And then, of course, making the 2017 tax reform permanent, because a lot of those reforms from 2017 are due to roll off in 2025. So if Biden were to win, you can assume there would be tax hikes. And if Trump wins, you'll see either maintaining the 2017 tax cuts or even lowering them more. And you saw what corporate tax cuts did for the economy in the final 2 years of Trump's administration. So I think he wins on the economic record for sure, and that's why you see that reflected in the polls as well. So I'm pretty optimistic that if Trump wins, we'll see a much better economy.
Talking about tax cuts, look, to stay competitive, stay the world's #1 economy, the US is going to need to invest massively in infrastructure over the next few years, particularly the green transition. Surely cutting taxes is not going to allow that infrastructure to happen. Therefore, the US will become more uncompetitive in the future.
Well, that's if if you have a Keynesian view or modern monetary theory view. But, in fact, what I think Trump will do is cut back on a lot of the green spending, the net zero spending. And then in terms of infrastructure, only 25% of Biden's infrastructure bill actually went to infrastructure. Most of his $4 trillion went to social welfare, corporate welfare, net zero policies, other subsidies like for college tuition. So I don't think that's good for the economy. So Trump, on the other hand, would liberate the private sector and encourage business investment, which ends up leading to job creation as well as increase in supply. So I think you're right, though. They can't continue the spending binge without raising taxes. I think the alternative is to cut spending and also cut taxes.
Always great to talk to you, Greg, on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thanks, Adrian. Great to be here. Thanks.
Now, Turkey's inflation rate has cooled for the first time in 8 months. Consumer prices slipped to almost 72% in June from 75.5% the previous month. The monthly rate of inflation also fell sharply to 1.6%. Footwear and transportation are now cheaper, but housing prices continue to rise sharply. Economists say that indicates Turkey's pivot away from unconventional monetary policy is starting to bear fruit. Philippine carrier Cebu Pacific is to buy up 152 Airbus planes worth $24 billion. The deal is considered the largest aircraft order in the country's aviation history. Cebu Pacific says it would use Pratt & Whitney engines for the planes. That's despite reporting problems with the firm's engines, which had forced the airline to ground at least 10 aircraft. A much-needed legislative victory for Argentina's president. Parliament has approved Javier Milei's sweeping economic reform bill after months of political wrangling. Its passage sends a message to investors that Milei has the political backing to bring the economy back on track, even though massively watered down. Markets rallied after the proposal was approved, but the nation has entered a technical recession. Poverty and homelessness are on the rise. Now, despite that, the president insists his tough fiscal medicine, aimed mainly at slashing spending and debt, will help to turn the economy around. Jacob Brown reports.
107 votos negativos.
And with that, Argentina's parliament finally approved a controversial economic reform package, the culmination of months of fierce debate, protests and public outcry. Though slightly watered down, the package of free market reforms still gives broad powers to self-proclaimed anarcho-capitalist president Javier Milei, including more control over energy, pensions and security. It also ushers in new tax amnesties, labour reforms and the privatisation of some state-owned companies.
Our families need to understand that what we are doing is essential to create a prosperous new Argentina, leaving behind the misery caused by the previous governments.
As MPs cast their votes, protests raged outside, the word democracy written across the funeral wreath.
This law presents complete labour reform, worsening conditions for workers in a country where more than 50% of the population is already below the poverty line.
Milei was elected 6 months ago, at a time when Argentina's inflation had soared to nearly 300%. During his campaign, he famously wielded a chainsaw, a symbol of his promise to slash state interference in the economy.
Today, as a society, as a country, and as a political body, we are at a crossroad. We can persist in the road to decadence, or we continue in the path to freedom.
He was quick to implement a shock austerity plan, freezing public works, terminating more than 200,000 social welfare plans, and announcing plans to fire 70,000 government workers. He says it's working. Inflation has slowed, and Argentina's budget went from a multi-billion-dollar deficit in December to its first quarterly surplus in more than 16 years in April. But Milei's policies have also caused a sharp drop in consumption. Unemployment and poverty are on the rise. A major devaluation of the peso against the dollar has strangled people's purchasing power.
I am here because I get paid the minimum pension and I cannot survive on it. I worked for 33 years and my pension is $200. With these laws the president is supporting, we are all going to be impoverished. We are going to lose our rights.
Milei is convinced he's on the right path to reform Argentina's economy. Economists fear widespread deregulation means industry and small and medium-sized businesses will suffer the most. And a large part of the population fears their living standards will only get worse. Jacob Brown, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, let's take a look at how Milei's shock therapy is working 6 months into his presidency. Argentina entered a technical recession in the first 3 months of the year after the economy shrank for 2 consecutive quarters. Argentina's budget went from a fiscal deficit of $120 billion in December to a surplus of $299 million in April. Annual inflation reached almost 300% in April. However, the month-on-month rate fell to 8.8%, the first time since October that it wasn't in double figures. The number of people living in poverty increased to 55%. Trades unions have taken to the streets to protest against the president's economic policies, but the International Monetary Fund has said that Milei's government performance was better than expected and its economic program was firmly back on track. To discuss all of that, we're joined by Jimena Blanco, Senior Research Director and Chief Analyst at global risk firm Verisk Maplecroft. She's in Malaga, in Spain. Good to have you with us, Jimena, as always. So, massively watered down this plan was. Nonetheless, it got through Parliament. Is it working?
Well, thank you for having me, Adrian. I think, at first, in some areas, it certainly is. Inflation is coming down, which was maybe one of the main tasks that Javier Milei had at hand when he first took office. The monthly inflation rate in May posted at 4.2% against nearly 30% in December. So it's clearly coming down. Now, the key pending issue is, when will this shock program, right, this suffering that the Argentine people are going through right now, start paying dividends? When will the economy start turning around? And will this be quick enough for Javier Milei to be able to reap the political benefits of it as he heads into an election, a midterm election in 2025?
When you say how long, I mean, it's not going to be a quick fix, is it? So Argentinians are in for some pretty bad pain for some time to come yet.
Absolutely. And I think the government was Javier Milei was honest about this on the campaign trail, right? His voters knew that a shock program was coming, that it wasn't going to be an easy fix. The government has been completely honest about, this very tough road ahead over the first 6 months. Now, Javier Milei has said that the green shoots should start coming through in the second half of this year, particularly in Q4. And I think that's when we're going to start really seeing whether he can maintain voter patience, right? People are paying a major price for this shock program. Can he maintain that support of about half of the population going into 2025? But most crucially, is that enough to restore investor confidence so he can start getting the inflows of investment that he needs to start creating quality jobs in the private sector?
And what about the IMF? Even though Argentina's people are in for quite a painful ride here, the IMF seems to be quite pleased with what Milei is doing.
Well, I think there's two parts to that, right? The first one is the IMF has a lot of experience in Argentina and with Argentina, and most of it has been far from positive. Now, the previous administration wasn't really implementing the program it had agreed with the IMF, whereas the current administration is. So from the point of view of deregulation, market liberalization, it's understandable that the IMF is supportive of Argentina because it aligns with its own principles. Now, I think the flip side of that is the IMF is also very concerned and paying attention to the social situation in the country. And we could argue to some degree it has learned from its past experiences in Argentina, where IMF programs have often succumbed to social discontent, protests, and a subsequent crisis. So I think the fund is being very cautious, supportive on the economic front, but also demanding that the government keeps a very close attention to the social situation and supporting the most vulnerable in society.
As we said, the country is now in a technical recession. If the country is in recession, where is the growth that it desperately needs going to come from?
Well, Argentina has three areas of what we call their economic engines, right? Agriculture, where the country is not only a major exporter of foodstuffs, but also of agricultural technology. And that's an area where we've actually seen significant growth under the Milei administration. And the other one is energy, right? Both oil and gas and metals and mining are two areas where, the industry is booming in the country. Interestingly, all three of those areas require much more skilled labor force, technological investment and diversification. And that is where the government is betting it's going to reactivate the economy. There is a fourth area where Argentina, it's not currently growing, but has a lot of potential, and that is the knowledge economy and services. And again, if we look at a lot of Milei's agenda overseas in the first 6 months of his administration, he's been courting exactly that industry, particularly tech investment coming in from Silicon Valley. The question is, will his efforts result in investments over the coming 6 months? And I think this is where, the proof will be.
All right, Jimena, that's Argentina. Stay with us for a few minutes because I want to talk to you about Peru, which is coming up next. China and Peru are strengthening their economic ties. The presidents of the two nations signed a plan to expand cooperation on trade and technology in Beijing last week. Now, Peru is a major destination for Chinese investment under the Belt and Road Initiative with the flagship Chancay megaport. The $3.5 billion facility is due to be inaugurated later this year and will help turn Peru into Latin America's hub for trade with Asia. But the US is worried that the project could affect its influence in the region, as Mariana Sanchez reports.
Vilma Lu grew up in Chancay. She says she's never seen so much economic activity in this small city north of Lima. The construction of a megaport capable of handling ships with cargoes of more than 20,000 containers each is to be finished by November. Global trade with Asia will soon be at the heart of this city of 70,000, which is changing rapidly.
There are many more businesses now. You can see roasted chicken chain restaurants, and now we have a mall. Chancay is progressing.
The megaport, a private Chinese-Peruvian joint venture, will handle 1 million containers in its first year of operation. Chancay is expected to become the maritime trade hub of Latin America.
Chancay was mainly a fishing and agricultural region. For example, here, farmers used to grow corn, cabbages, or pumpkins, but now much of the land is up for sale.
Chancay's mayor says development is a challenge. He says Peru's government is not ready for what the port operations will entail for the region.
We envision the benefits in the future. The port will be the locomotive and the wagons behind will be, for example, a car factory, a tax-free zone. But I feel my hands are tied because the president and government haven't yet produced an urban development plan.
It's estimated that 30,000 jobs will be created in the next 10 years, and development will expand well beyond the city.
We see development for 3 surrounding cities, but also regions in the north and as far as the jungle that are far away now, but will certainly benefit from the industrial development in the long run.
Vilma, who manages a restaurant, says she's living in a land of opportunity she could never have imagined.
I've always thought of leaving the country for a better life, but now there's work in Chancay, and I will keep on planning what other jobs I can do related to the port.
China is Peru's #1 trading partner, and ties are likely to become much stronger. People here are hoping they will reap the benefits. They're looking forward to a brighter, more prosperous future. Mariana Sanchez, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Chancay.
Let's talk about this with Jimena. What do you make of this port in Chancay? Is Peru pivoting towards China here, and how is that going to affect its relations with the US?
Well, let's start from the fact that Chinese investment in Latin America is neither new and particularly not in Peru. And with Peru having been the second largest recipient of Chinese investment in the region over the past 20 years, coming second only to Brazil. The second point is, this makes a lot of sense from the perspective of economic diversification, both in Peru as well as on the Chinese side. I think, as we talk about geopolitical tensions between the United States and China, it makes sense that there's concerns in different parts of the world as investment happens. But it's important to note that these investments and flows of investments have not triggered a major upsurge in tensions between, Peru and the United States or Peru and China. So I think it's part of a new economic setting that we're going to see in the coming decades as diversification happens across the globe. Now, it's likely that we will see at points this result in, different conversations about the strategy of various countries. But I think when we look at the particulars of this investment, it's coming from a private company financed in China. So it's less of a sovereign to sovereign relationship, but rather more of a private sector direct investment into the Peruvian economy.
Jimena, always great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, Qatar has launched a new tourism project centered around a large amusement park that's poised to be bigger than Walt Disney's Magic Kingdom. The $5.5 billion Smaisma project will be located north of the gas-rich nation's capital, Doha, and will span 8 million square meters. It'll include an 18-hole golf course, 300 villas, luxury resorts, a marina, beach club, as well as homes and shops. The project is part of the government's plan to boost tourism and diversify its economy. And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at A. Finnegan on X. Please try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC. You can drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. And of course, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. And there you'll find individual links, reports, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.